Mission 2, start. Thank you. Shotgun.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoterica on our continuing series, Metal Slug Madness, where I review every single mainline Metal Slug game ever made and talk about the history and evolution of the franchise. Today we're going to be taking a look at Metal Slug 2. It's a little bit of a black sheep, but I still think it's an incredible game and I do want to talk about it. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like, subscribe, and that notification bell definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, we have a Patreon link down below as well. But honestly, I'm sure a lot of people watching this, if you've played all the Metal Slug games, are going to say, don't play Metal Slug 2, play Metal Slug X. Because Metal Slug 2 has a very interesting history. It is an excellent game, but performance-wise, it feels like it's about ready to break at any given point in time. This has some of the worst slowdown I have ever seen in an arcade game. At some points in time, it feels like it might be running at 4 to 5 frames per second. So what SNK did, and this is after Nazca was folded into SNK, is they re-released Metal Slug 2 as Metal Slug X, which fixed a lot of the performance, but changed and expanded the game enough where Metal Slug 2 should and does need to be reviewed on its own because there are a lot of fundamental differences. And as soon as we get in here, you can see that tonally, this is a complete shift from the original Metal Slug, where we're talking about it feeling like it's a pseudo World War II European war front. Now, I still get some of those vibes of the European War, but this seems a little bit more like North Africa when Patton was going north with the tank army trying to get into Europe. I like World War II history, just a little aside. But this game tonally is 100% different than the original Metal Slug, and I love that because they were always changing what Metal Slug was doing. Now, of course, the game plays exactly the same, but it looks totally different. And this game is even more beautiful to watch in motion than the original Metal Slug, because look at all those banners in the background rippling in the wind as this gigantic, helicopter ship comes in. It's just spectacular, and as the enemies jump on them, they depress. That's a lot of why this game runs as poorly as it does, because the developers were just putting everything on screen at once. It is just maximum impact, and of course that's going to impact the frame rate. As I mentioned in the first video, my one strike against Metal Slug being that the boss battles weren't that epic. In Metal Slug 2, that is not true at all. These are some of the best boss battles I've ever played in arcade gaming. One of the most interesting things about Metal Slug 2 and on is that the series kind of develops its sense of humor starting here, because the original game, the sprites were kind of comical and they have that cartoony look to them, but everything else is played relatively straight. But when we get to Metal Slug 2, all of a sudden we're going to start getting mummies into the mix. And as the series goes on, we're going to see zombies, we're going to see aliens, we're going to see giant bug monsters. It gets a little bit more comical, and the series has always been great in my mind because it does have a sense of humor and doesn't take itself too seriously, and that's just something you didn't see in the original Metal Slug, because very shortly I will get hit by the mummy's breath and I will turn into a mummy myself, and I will not be able to throw bombs, and I'm going to move very slowly. But if you duck down, you turn into a pile of bandages. Again, the sprite work and animation is just spectacular in the game, but I like how this game doesn't take itself too seriously, and the franchise in and of itself always has a great sense of humor, and that's just something that we didn't get as much of in the original game. But graphically, because I talked about it so much in the original, Metal Slug 2 looks even better than the first game. And that's not to say the first game is any slouch, but just all of the animations, all of the backgrounds, the color palette that they chose is just really fun. These are some of the best looking games on the Neo Geo platform, in my opinion. And like I said earlier, the boss battles are absolutely epic. You're going to see here we jump into this slug and we have a downward shot and a downward cannon. And very shortly, out of nowhere, the boss is just going to come up. It's this gigantic, almost alligator dog-like jaw system, and you need to continually navigate your platforming while also shooting down. It just feels so intense. We have projectiles that we have to avoid. You need to be playing perfectly to not take a death here, and I do certainly take a few deaths in the capture. But even all the animations of that laser projectile, it's just filling the screen changes color based on the color shot, everything just looks perfect. When you're playing a boss battle in this game, you know it's going to be intense and you're going to have an absolute ton of fun. I even like when you're stuck in a ledge there, he has that thing of snot coming out of his nose because he's so nervous. But as good as this game looks, it sounds even better, so go ahead and listen for 30-45 seconds and I'll come back and tell you more about why you should play Metal Slug 2 as well as Metal Slug X. But enjoy!
Thank
I just love how fast-paced and frantic the music sounds with that jazzy horn. Now, it's kind of anachronistic in the way that it doesn't totally fit the game as far as you wouldn't expect to hear jazz in a war setting, but it 100% works for what they are trying to do. It's just a lot of fun, and each soundtrack element is going to have its own feel, and it's going to do a really good job. But when I mentioned the comedy, these tanks here just kind of squirt out bombs that roll around on the ground. The tanks look like they're just going to shoot a massive projectile at top speed, but when they actually shoot at you, it just kind of plops out and rolls slowly, which to me is a little bit of like slapstick visual humor. But again, when I said the boss fights were epic, they absolutely are. General Morden's tank here has this sort of crab theme, and that's going to be something that you're going to see a lot of in the Metal Slug series, at least through Metal Slug 3, as a lot of the bosses have some sort of crustacean element going to them, which is funny because the game is called Metal Slug. You think there'd be a little bit more slug design in it, but every boss has some sort of animal nature to it, and I think the design is really creative because that 100% looks like a horseshoe crab you would see on a beach somewhere, except it's a giant mechanical tank. But moving on, we are now in what I assume to be Tokyo, and again, it's a totally different vibe, it's a different stage, the music has more of an Asian flair to it, but again, it just looks absolutely beautiful, and it might be Hong Kong or somewhere around there because the background looks a little bit like Kowloon, the walled city to me, but that's just me taking inspiration from where I've seen things. But again, it's just filled to the brim with detail. We have this double-decker bus, which makes me think Hong Kong when the British were in charge, but there's just so much going on, and you're getting to look at all these spectacular things while you're just playing the game, and you even have a smoking monkey eating dim sum buns. And what other game do you have that coming towards you? It's just a lot of fun, and like I mentioned earlier, this game has an amazing sense of humor, even so much so that if you eat too many fatty foods, you get fat, and as opposed to hitting enemies with your knife, you're going to stick them with a fork. Now, if you see enough vegetables come up and you eat those, you can actually thin out. But when you're fat, you move really slowly, and your bombs are actually circular bombs with a little fuse on the top. Even the bombs get fat. And I just love it because there's no real reason to put that in the game. You didn't need to change the knife to a fork. You didn't make the bombs seem to be fat. But the developers at SNK said, hey, how can we drive this game further? How can we make it more interesting? How can we fill it with more details? And that's why you get stuff like forks and fat bombs. But moving on to the next boss, when I talked about that crab theme, this feels to me like a hermit crab. It's kind of crawling along the beach and it has its own home on its back. Now maybe I'm reading into it a little bit too much, but mechanically it is another epic boss battle because you have your Metal Slug here, you're going back and forth, and there's about 6 different turrets that we need to destroy before we can get to the next stage of the boss, and you're constantly worrying about having to move left and right and not get hit by different things. And when you're playing well and everything's clicking, it just feels great. And I will definitively say that Metal Slug is my favorite run and gun franchise of all time. I prefer this to Contra, I prefer this to Demon Front. If I want to play a 16-bit 2D run and gun game, I am putting Metal Slug on. But again, as we move into another area, everything changes again, and that's one of the biggest things I can say about Metal Slug, at least through Metal Slug 3, is it never feels boring because you're always excited to see what happens next. But of course, this game was superseded by Metal Slug X, and that's what you're going to be seeing next week, and we'll talk about the fundamental differences and what stays the same. But leave me a question or comment down below. Have you played Metal Slug 2, or are you just someone who wants to play Metal Slug X? I will be back next Tuesday with another entry in the Metal Slug series, and I'll have videos throughout the week as well. Like I mentioned earlier, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe with that notification bell. It definitely helps me out. But if you want to play a run and gun game, you could do a lot worse than Metal Slug 2, because what other game gives you teddy bears as bonuses? We'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.